It's easy to forget that even the biggest stars of the silver screen often come from the humblest beginnings, and Tom Berenger is one of the best examples of that truth. Before I dive into his extraordinary story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep look at the lives behind Hollywood's most fascinating actors. Today, we're exploring the journey of Tom Berenger, from a boy growing up in the Midwest to one of the most recognizable faces of 1980s and 1990s cinema. A man whose characters were unforgettable, whose personal life was turbulent, and whose legacy is far more enduring than the highs and lows of fame. This isn't just about an actor's career. It's the story of resilience, transformation, and what it means to leave behind more than just a filmography. Tom Berenger's early life set the stage for the kind of man and performer he would later become. Born in 1949 in Chicago, he was raised in a strict Irish Catholic household where discipline, faith, and tradition guided his upbringing. The Chicago of that era was a city full of grit, working-class pride, and family-centered values, qualities that seeped into his character. While many actors find their inspiration later in life, Berenger's was planted in childhood. Family road trips became more than vacations. They were adventures that sparked his imagination. Long hours in the back seat of a car, staring out windows at fields, highways, and historic landmarks, cultivated his deep love of history and a fascination with stories of the past. These moments of quiet observation would later shape his ability to inhabit characters who carried layers of inner conflict, weariness, and conviction. It was clear from a young age that Berenger had both curiosity and resilience. He wasn't born into privilege or the arts. There were no Hollywood connections waiting for him, no shortcuts to fame. His path would be carved through work ethic and a relentless drive to find meaning in the stories he told. As a boy, he devoured history books and biographies, not realizing that this grounding in humanity's struggles and triumphs would later give him a deep well of emotion to pull from as an actor. His household, guided by religious values and strict discipline, demanded respect, structure, and toughness, all traits that showed up decades later when he portrayed hardened soldiers, weary lawmen, and morally conflicted men. His toughness wasn't just a performance, it was rooted in how he was raised. Despite his love for storytelling and history, Berenger didn't immediately pursue acting. He followed a more traditional path by enrolling at the University of Missouri, where he studied journalism. This choice may seem surprising given the career he would eventually embrace, but journalism taught him two skills that became vital to his craft: curiosity about the human experience and the ability to see beyond the surface of a story. Journalism forced him to ask questions, to probe motives, and to understand the nuances of human behavior. Later, when Berenger stood in front of a camera, those instincts gave his performances depth. He wasn't just memorizing lines, he was investigating what made his characters tick. But like many young people fresh out of college, Berenger's road wasn't smooth or straightforward. After earning his degree, he worked a string of odd jobs that had nothing to do with acting or writing. He spent time as a hotel porter, lugging heavy bags for strangers, and even labored in a chemical plant, learning firsthand the physical demands and dangers of blue-collar work. Perhaps most unusual, he also worked as a flight attendant. Each of these jobs might seem unrelated to acting, but they weren't wasted years. Instead, they became part of his reservoir of lived experience. When Berenger played working-class characters or men hardened by labor and survival, he wasn't guessing. He was drawing from what he had personally lived. These early jobs gave him authenticity, a grounding that audiences would feel years later on screen. Eventually, the pull of storytelling and performance became too strong to ignore. New York City, with its buzzing theater scene and reputation as the crucible of American acting, called to him. Berenger took the leap and moved there, a bold decision that would change everything. He began studying acting seriously, throwing himself into the craft. The discipline instilled in him from childhood served him well in this demanding world. Acting isn't just about talent. It requires focus, endurance, and the ability to withstand rejection. Berenger had all of that, forged from years of structure and resilience. His first real break came not on the silver screen, but on television, in the world of soap operas. He landed a role on One Life to Live, a long-running daytime drama. While soap operas often get dismissed as over-the-top or formulaic, they are some of the toughest proving grounds for actors. Scripts change daily, emotional range is tested constantly, and performers must memorize staggering amounts of dialogue on short notice. Berenger cut his teeth here, honing his skills, finding his confidence, and proving he had what it took to survive in a brutal industry. From there, his early film work began to open doors. Roles in Looking for Mr. Goodbar, 1977, and The Dogs of War, 1980, introduced him to wider audiences. These were not flashy, glamorous parts, but they showcased his strengths: a rugged physicality, a brooding intensity, and a sense that beneath the surface of his characters was always a storm of inner conflict. Critics and audiences alike noticed something different about him. He wasn't a polished Hollywood leading man with a smooth smile and a predictable presence. Instead, he seemed real, flawed, complicated, and magnetic. This grounded, authentic energy would become his signature and set him apart in a crowded field of actors vying for recognition. The groundwork of Berenger's early life, the discipline of his upbringing, the curiosity of his journalism background, the grit of his odd jobs, and the training of his early acting years created a foundation that would soon carry him to one of the most defining roles of his career. But even before that moment, there was already a sense that Tom Berenger wasn't just another actor chasing fame. He was a craftsman, a storyteller, and someone whose life had prepared him uniquely for the complex roles he would go on to embody.
When most people think of Tom Berenger, one role often comes to mind above all others: the battle-hardened, scarred, and unforgettable Sergeant Barnes for Platoon. This wasn't just another movie role. It was the performance that would forever cement Berenger's place in Hollywood history. But what makes the story so compelling isn't only the success that came with the role. It's the grueling process that led to it, the physical and emotional strain he endured, and how the part became a mirror for everything he had built in his career up until that point. By the mid-1980s, Berenger had already proven himself capable of carrying gritty, complex characters. Yet, Platoon was a different beast entirely. Oliver Stone, himself a Vietnam veteran, wasn't interested in making a glossy war movie. He wanted authenticity, rawness, and pain that mirrored the chaos of the real Vietnam War. For Berenger, this meant more than just showing up and learning lines. To step into the role of Sergeant Barnes, he had to give himself over completely to the brutal world Stone was determined to recreate. Before cameras even rolled, the cast underwent a boot camp in the Philippines designed to mimic the exhaustion, fear, and pressure combat. Unlike today's carefully orchestrated method acting experiences, this boot camp wasn't a watered-down simulation. The actors were forced into punishing physical training with little food, little sleep, and relentless drills under military supervision. For younger actors, it was a shock. But Berenger, now in his late 30s and armed with the discipline forged in his Chicago upbringing, rose to the challenge. He pushed through the discomfort, drawing on every ounce of resilience he had developed over years of odd jobs, setbacks, and personal trials. The exhaustion in his eyes on screen wasn't acting, it was real. Sergeant Barnes wasn't just another war character. He embodied the darkest corners of human nature. With his scarred face, cold stare, and terrifying moral ambiguity, Barnes became one of cinema's most chilling portrayals of soldier. He was both a leader and a villain, a man capable of brutality, but also, in some strange way, respected by those who followed him. Berenger leaned into that complexity, avoiding cliches and creating a character that still sparks debate today. Was Barnes purely evil, or was he the inevitable product of a senseless war? Berenger didn't provide easy answers. He forced audiences to wrestle with the question themselves. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and rightfully so. Critics praised his intensity, his willingness to go places many actors wouldn't, and his ability to carry both menace and humanity in the same performance. For Berenger, this wasn't just recognition, it was validation. After years of grinding through television roles and secondary parts in films, he had finally reached the peak of Hollywood's attention. And yet, unlike many actors who explode onto the scene with a breakthrough role, Berenger's ascent felt earned. It was the culmination of everything that had come before. The toughness from his working-class jobs, the observation skills from journalism, the discipline of his upbringing, and the authenticity forged through years of struggle. But Platoon did more than just elevate Berenger's career. It reshaped the trajectory of 1980 cinema. The film itself was a cultural earthquake. At a time when America was still grappling with the legacy of Vietnam, Stone's film ripped away any sanitized notions of war. And at the center of it all was Berenger's Barnes, a character who refused to be forgotten. For audiences, Barnes represented not just a man, but the psychological scars of war itself. It's no exaggeration to say that without Berenger's performance, Platoon wouldn't have had the same visceral impact. After Platoon, Berenger entered what many consider his golden era. Hollywood recognized the intensity he brought, and roles began to pour in that capitalized on his ability to play men of authority, danger, and complexity. In Ridley Scott's Someone to Watch Over Me, 1987, he shifted gears to play a romantic lead, showcasing that his talents weren't confined to brutality alone. Then came films like Shoot to Kill and Betrayed, where he played men caught in webs of violence, deception, and inner conflict. Each role built on the reputation he had solidified with Platoon. Berenger was the actor you turned to when you needed someone who could embody both strength and vulnerability, someone who could carry the weight of a story on his shoulders. One of his most beloved roles from this era wasn't a soldier or a villain at all, but Jake Taylor in the sports comedy Major League, 1989. Here, Berenger tapped into his natural charm and humor, playing a washed-up catcher trying to lead his team despite aging knees and fading abilities. The realism he brought to the role wasn't just performance. It reflected his own body's wear and tear from years of demanding roles and physical strain. Audiences loved him in this part, proving he wasn't limited to grim, heavy characters. He could make people laugh, root for him, and see themselves in his struggles. The 1990s further cemented his reputation as a leading man. In Sniper, 1993, he once again returned to military action, but with a new layer of precision and psychological depth. The film was a box office success and spawned multiple sequels, with Berenger reprising his role across decades. Then, in The Substitute, 1996, he played a hardened mercenary taking on inner-city criminals disguised as a schoolteacher, blending action with social commentary. These roles kept him in the public eye and solidified his image as a rugged, tough, but deeply human screen presence. What's remarkable about this golden era is how seamlessly Berenger moved between genres. Few actors of his generation could jump from intense war dramas to romantic thrillers, from comedies to action blockbusters, without losing their authenticity. He had range, but he also had consistency. audiences never doubted his commitment to a role, no matter the genre. Whether he was portraying a hardened killer or a washed-up ballplayer, Berenger brought the same depth and believability every time. At this point, Berenger had become more than just a familiar face. He was a symbol of a certain kind of American cinema. His characters embodied grit, resilience, and conflict, often wrestling with morality, mortality, or the weight of responsibility. It was during these years that his name became etched into Hollywood's tapestry, not as a fleeting star, but as an actor whose performances carried weight long after the credits rolled. Tom Berenger's career in the late 1980s and 1990s was marked by success, but what truly set him apart was his remarkable versatility. Unlike actors who found themselves typecast in one niche, Berenger was able to move fluidly between genres, embodying roles that stretched from brutal villains to deeply sympathetic protagonists. This ability wasn't just about skill. It was rooted in his unique life experiences and the discipline that had shaped him since childhood. He didn't rely on a single persona. Instead, he crafted each character with nuance, drawing from the people he had met, the history he had studied, and the struggles he had endured personally. Perhaps the most striking element of Berenger's versatility was his comfort with contradiction. He could play a cold-blooded killer in one film and a tender, vulnerable romantic in the next, and neither felt forced. For example, in Betrayed, 1988, he delivered a chilling performance as a man leading a dangerous double life, a role that forced audiences to confront uncomfortable questions about trust and morality. Just a year later, in Major League, he embodied Jake Taylor, the washed-up catcher with humor, warmth, and everyman charm that made audiences cheer for him. The fact that both characters felt authentic and both left lasting impressions speaks volumes about his range as a performer. Another layer of his versatility came through his willingness to embrace historical roles. In 1993, Berenger took on the part of Confederate General James Longstreet in Gettysburg, a sweeping war epic that demanded more than just charisma or screen presence. This was a role steeped in history, and it required an actor who could balance authority with humanity. Berenger gave Longstreet a quiet strength and a sense of moral conflict that stood out even amid the film's massive scale and ensemble cast. His performance earned him respect not only from audiences, but from historians and Civil War enthusiasts who praised the authenticity he brought to the role. This wasn't just another job for him. It was an extension of his lifelong fascination with history and his ability to channel that knowledge into his work. During this era, Berenger also leaned into action films that played to his rugged persona. Sniper became one of his most enduring roles, and audiences couldn't get enough of his portrayal of a weary, skilled marksman caught in dangerous missions around the world. Unlike other action stars of the 1990s, who often relied on bravado or exaggerated heroics, Berenger's Sniper was believable. He wasn't a caricature. He was a soldier who felt real, with all the wear and tear that comes with such a life. This believability made the film resonate with viewers and ensured that the role would live on in multiple sequels spanning decades. At the same time, Berenger never abandoned smaller, character-driven projects. He seemed to understand that an actor's craft isn't sustained only by blockbusters or box office numbers. It's also built in those quieter roles where subtlety matters more than spectacle. In thrillers like Shattered, 1991, and dramas like At Play in the Fields of the Lord, 1991, he proved he could carry films that demanded psychological complexity rather than physical action. These choices reflected his commitment to being a storyteller first and foremost. However, as the 1990s drew to a close, Hollywood itself began to change. The industry leaned more heavily into spectacle, CGI, and youth-driven franchises. The kind of roles that Berenger excelled at, the grounded, gritty, character-based performances, were slowly being pushed aside. The archetype of the rugged, weathered man was losing its place in a Hollywood that now favored sleek, polished action stars or ensemble superhero casts. Berenger, once at the top of casting lists, found himself facing a new challenge, staying relevant in an industry that was moving away from the very qualities that had made him great. Adding to the difficulty were the personal challenges that mirrored the turbulence of his professional life. He endured a series of divorces, each one more public and painful than the last. Legal disputes over alleged malpractice surrounding one of his divorces added to the strain, creating headlines that sometimes overshadowed his work. Rumors about substance abuse circulated, though Berenger himself rarely addressed them directly. What was undeniable was that the man who had once dominated screens was now fighting battles both on and off the stage. Yet even as Hollywood shifted and personal struggles mounted, Berenger's versatility kept him working. He wasn't headlining blockbuster franchises anymore, but he continued to take roles that mattered to him. He appeared in independent films, television projects, and eventually found a late career triumph in the critically acclaimed miniseries Hatfields and McCoys, 2012. His performance there reminded audiences of his power, earning him an Emmy and proving that his talent had never faded. It had simply been waiting for the right project to showcase it again. It's worth noting that his journey during these years reflected a broader truth about acting. Fame in Hollywood is fickle. Trends shift, stars rise and fall, and audiences move on. But versatility, real, authentic versatility, creates longevity. Berenger's ability to move between genres, to embody vastly different characters, and to remain committed to his craft allowed him to outlast many of his contemporaries. While some actors of his era disappeared when their type went out of style, Berenger endured because he wasn't defined by one role, one genre, or one decade. By the end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Tom Berenger's star power had dimmed compared to his Platoon and Sniper days, but his reputation as a serious actor remained intact. He had proven that he could adapt, take risks, and deliver performances that audiences remembered long after the credits rolled. His career was no longer about chasing constant spotlight, but about finding roles that mattered, roles that would remind people of why they had admired him in the first place. By the time the 2000s arrived, Tom Berenger was no longer the marquee name he had been during his golden years, but that didn't mean his career was finished. In fact, this phase of his life was about something deeper: resilience, reinvention, and a shift toward a kind of peace that had often eluded him in his earlier decades. While many of his contemporaries faded completely from view, Berenger continued working steadily, finding meaningful roles, rediscovering his personal life, and carving out a legacy that went far beyond box office numbers. One of the most notable aspects of Berenger's later career was how he embraced supporting roles and projects outside the typical Hollywood machine. No longer pressured to be the leading man, he seemed to find freedom in choosing parts that interested him, whether in smaller independent films, television movies, or the occasional blockbuster. Perhaps the best example of this was his role in Christopher Nolan's Inception, 2010, where he played Peter Browning, a corporate figure caught in the dream world heist. Though not the flashiest role in the film, Berenger's grounded presence provided balance in a story swirling with spectacle and surrealism. His appearance reminded audiences that even after decades, he could bring credibility and gravitas to any project. But his true late-career triumph came with Hatfields and McCoys, 2012, the History Channel miniseries that revisited the infamous American family feud. Berenger played Jim Vance, a violent and unpredictable figure, and his performance was nothing short of magnetic. The role demanded intensity, menace, and authenticity, qualities that Berenger had built his entire career on. For his work, he won a Primetime Emmy Award, a recognition that not only validated his talent, but also reintroduced him to a new generation of viewers who may have only known him from Platoon or Sniper. It was a reminder that Berenger wasn't just a star of the past. He was still capable of commanding the screen with the same force as he had in his prime. Outside of these highlights, Berenger continued to reprise roles that fans loved. The Sniper franchise, which had begun in the early 1990s, continued to spawn sequels, and Berenger remained connected to the character of Thomas Becket. While some of these later films were direct-to-video releases, they still had a loyal audience, and Berenger approached them with seriousness rather than cynicism. For him, it seemed less about chasing prestige and more about honoring the characters that had defined so much of his career. On the personal side, Berenger's life was often just as dramatic as his screen roles. He had been married multiple times, 4 in total, and fathered 6 children across those marriages. The instability of his family life was often in the spotlight, and in many ways, it mirrored the turbulence of his career. Yet in 2012, the same year he won his Emmy, Berenger also found what appears to be his lasting personal happiness. He married Laura Moretti, and together they embraced a lifestyle far removed from the chaos of Hollywood. Rather than chasing red carpets and media attention, the couple chose to live nomadically, spending time in an RV, traveling across the United States and Europe, and enjoying a quieter, freer existence. This shift was more than just a lifestyle choice. It represented a turning point for Berenger. For decades, he had been chasing roles, fighting for relevance, and enduring the pressures of fame and personal strife. Now, with Moretti by his side, he seemed to discover a different kind of fulfillment. It was a stark contrast to the man who once embodied the ruthless Sergeant Barnes or the hardened Sniper Beckett. Away from the camera, Berenger was no longer defined by toughness or turmoil. He was defined by peace. Still, his career in this later stage showed his enduring work ethic. Many actors in his position might have retired quietly, but Berenger kept showing up, proving that he still had something to contribute. His name may not have been at the top of every marquee, but his presence in a film or series always brought weight. Directors and audiences alike knew that when Berenger was on screen, the character would feel real, layered, and believable. It's also worth considering how Berenger's later years reflected a broader truth about Hollywood careers. Fame is fleeting, but craft endures. While his era of leading man dominance had passed, Berenger's dedication to the craft of acting never wavered. He wasn't interested in reinventing himself as a blockbuster superstar again. He was interested in telling stories, in embodying characters that mattered, and in keeping his artistry alive. That quiet commitment often goes unnoticed in an industry obsessed with celebrity. But for Berenger, it defined his legacy. And in many ways, his personal reinvention in these years paralleled his professional one. Just as he no longer needed to chase leading man status in Hollywood, he no longer seemed to be chasing validation in his personal life. His marriage to Laura Moretti and their decision to live on their own terms showed a man who had found something more valuable than fame: contentment. For someone who had experienced both the extreme highs of Oscar nominations and the lows of public divorces and career downturns, this piece may well be the greatest achievement of his life. When looking back at Tom Berenger's long and winding career, what stands out most is not just the films he made, but the kind of presence he brought to the screen and the legacy that presence left behind. For decades, audiences have been drawn to the combination of toughness and vulnerability he embodied, the way he could play men who were larger than life and yet deeply human. His career was never about chasing constant celebrity. Instead, it was about creating characters that stayed with people long after the lights in the theater went dark. His legacy begins with the undeniable power of Platoon. Sergeant Barnes remains one of the most iconic performances in war film history, a role that continues to be studied by film students and remembered by audiences as both terrifying and unforgettable. But Berenger's influence didn't end with that one character. His work across genres demonstrated that an actor could move from villain to hero, from soldier to ballplayer, from historical figure to romantic lead, without ever losing credibility. That range became part of his enduring reputation, and it helped carve a path for other actors who didn't want to be trapped in one box. Consider the actors who came after him. Figures like Josh Brolin or Tom Hardy, performers who have built careers on balancing rugged physicality with emotional depth. While their paths are their own, the blueprint Berenger helped create is undeniable. He showed that audiences respond to complexity, to men who can be both strong and broken, intimidating and sympathetic. That influence is part of his true legacy, even if his name isn't always the first to come up in conversations about Hollywood icons. But Berenger's story isn't only about the industry. It's also about the human being behind the roles. His personal life was messy, with failed marriages, public disputes, and family challenges that often spilled into the press. And yet, in the later chapters of his life, he found something that eluded him in his earlier years: peace. With Laura Moretti, he built a life far away from the constant glare of Hollywood, choosing to live nomadically, exploring the world, and enjoying the kind of freedom many spend their lives chasing. This shift in priorities showed that legacy isn't just about what's captured on screen, it's about how a person evolves and what they leave behind in the lives of those closest to them. Even into his later years, Berenger kept acting, continuing to reprise roles in the Sniper franchise and taking on supporting parts in both television and film. His Emmy win for Hatfields and McCoys wasn't just a career resurgence. It was proof that his talent had never diminished. It reminded audiences that while Hollywood trends might change, true craftsmanship doesn't fade. He could step into a role decades after his breakout success and still deliver a performance powerful enough to demand attention. The lesson of Berenger's career is clear. Success in Hollywood isn't measured only by staying at the top of the A-list for decades. For some actors, it's about longevity, about leaving behind characters that continue to resonate, about influencing the next generation, and about carving out a space where one's work still matters long after the spotlight has shifted. Berenger may not have dominated headlines in recent years, but his performances remain part of the cultural memory, embedded in films that continue to be rewatched, studied, and appreciated. And perhaps his most important legacy lies in balance. For years, his career was defined by intensity, by playing men pushed to their limits. But in his personal journey, he showed that it's possible to find calm after chaos, to reinvent oneself after public struggles, and to build a meaningful life outside the pressures of fame. That balance between the unforgettable characters he gave to audiences and the peace he found for himself creates a picture of a man who lived fully, stumbled often, but ultimately discovered what truly mattered. When people look back at Tom Berenger, they may think of Barnes in Platoon, Jake Taylor in Major League, Thomas Beckett in Sniper, or a General Longstreet in Gettysburg. They'll think of the scarred soldier, the aging ball player, the steely sniper, and the conflicted general. But beyond those roles, what they'll remember is the feeling he left them with. The sense that these weren't just characters, but real people with history, weight, and heart. That is the essence of Berenger's legacy, not constant fame, but unforgettable humanity.